Everyone, I am very excited to be here and have a conversation with you that we've been having across the state around Oregon's water future. And as Melissa said, in my day job, I run a state agency that is called the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, which is a really weird name for a state agency. What we do is invest about $100 million of lottery and federal funds in things like native habitat for fish and for wildlife and water quality improvements. So if you go to any of the rivers around here, the Willamette River, the Clackamas, what you'll see are investments that we've done to make sure that our water is clean and available, that our fish and wildlife have a place where they can survive and thrive as well. So my day job is great. I had the opportunity starting in August this last year. I worked for Governor Brown. I was asked if I would lead Oregon's 100-year water vision. And so that's been my night job for about the last 6 or 7 months, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I'm going to go shortly into the standard presentation that I have, which will walk you through the same thing that we've been talking about in communities across the state. But just broadly, how many of you had water today? Okay, good. If you didn't, you should go get some. It's not good to be dehydrated. When you turned on that tap to put the water into your reusable bottle or the cup that you use, how many of you paused and said, boy, is this water clean enough for me to drink? Okay, a couple of you, and there might be reasons why you wondered if the water was clean enough to drink. The vast majority don't. We are honored and privileged to live in a place where the assumption is that our water is clean and available, that we turn on the tap and it comes out to us. We are honored and privileged to live in a place, I'm not sure how many of you are from Oregon, but folks know where Eugene is? Okay. Eugene's wastewater is water supply for folks like Salem. We are honored and privileged enough to know that Eugene is treating its wastewater well enough that it's okay for that wastewater to be clean enough that it becomes the water supply for a community downstream. That is not the case in a lot of places. So what I'm going to talk about and jump into in a formal presentation in a second is how do we continue that in the future? How do we make sure that what we take for granted now is not taken for granted, but that we're taking care of it as we move forward into the future? Melissa mentioned the definition of environmental justice, and I think one of the challenges that we face is that term, environmental justice, is something that is well known to people who work in that world. That impact of the access to clean water for low-income and disproportionately impacted communities is a big deal. When you step outside of those conversations, a lot of people don't know what environmental justice is and what it means and why it matters. So what I'm going to ask of you today as I go through this presentation is you all, for the rest of this session, you are my consultants, which is part of why I was very excited to have this conversation today, and I hope you'll come over to Rogue and give me your answers. I want you to think about the conversation I'm going to have about water and picture if you are a single parent in North Portland who is barely making enough money to pay their rent, what would happen if their water bill goes up? So put yourself in those shoes. I want you to think about being a tribal member in the middle of Oregon where there aren't enough people in your communities to support the funding for your water infrastructure. I want you to think from the perspective of an Eastern Oregon farmer who is barely getting by, who comes from a Hispanic community, is the first generation that is here, who needs water out in farm fields to make sure that migrant farm workers have enough clean water to drink. So I'm going to talk about generally what we're picturing for our water future, the goals that we have and the challenges that we have. My goal for you is to really think about how does that impact people who may not be sitting in this room, who may not have the time or the ability to participate in these conversations, and how do we engage ourselves and those partners in a way that makes sure that Oregon's water future is a water future for everybody. Everybody ought to be able to turn on the tap and have access to clean water. So again, as I go through this, I'm going to give a few examples. I'm going to be telling my own water story, and as I do, I ask you to think about yours. And I'm going to be telling some stories that I've heard around the state as well. so that you can get a perspective of some of the challenges folks are facing. Before I start, I want to check in the back. Am I okay, loud enough for, okay. All right, so as I said, Governor Brown kicked off Oregon's 100-year water vision this fall. There's a document that we handed around that is our first draft of what we would like Oregon's water future to look like. And what we did this fall is we went around to communities across the state and said, is this what you want your water future to look like? And so we're getting a lot of feedback. That's the reason if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, it says version 0.7. It's because we didn't want to go out with a blank sheet of paper, but we wanted to go out with something that folks could respond to. So as we get to questions later, if you have questions about this, I'm more than happy to answer them or suggestions or ideas. So first, my water story. I grew up in a little place in far eastern Oregon. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the state of Montana. Anyone? And I generally do get a laugh when I raise that. But if you take away the state borders and you think about the water that flows, the headwaters of the Columbia River starts in Canada and Montana. So that what we do with our water in Montana matters for Portland. It matters for Hood River. It matters for all of those downstream communities. So when we have a thing like the Hanford nuclear site, right, it matters how that is treated for downstream users. So where I grew up, this is actually a photo just up the way from my parents' house during flood stage on the Clark Fork River. We grew up in this amazingly beautiful place. Fairly rural community. Missoula's much smaller than a lot of the communities here. It's one of the larger communities in Montana, but pretty small. It has two rivers. There's a lot of folks in this room who will not remember the movie A River Runs Through It. But there's a movie that talks about this amazing fly fishing experience. I grew up where that book was written in the early 1900s. It is not where the movie was filmed because of some things I'm going to talk about now. So, beautiful, amazing, clean river. This is where people go to fly fish. This is where people go to recreate. I swam in this river consistently when I was a little kid, amazed I didn't drown myself at some point in time. Our family had well water that came, it's a fairly shallow aquifer, and so that water moves from the river underground and back up. So we were using water from the river, just happened to come from a well. Same with the community of Missoula. Pretty idyllic, a great way to grow up. Upstream from Missoula, there were some environmental challenges that happened in the early 1900s that we didn't know about until about 20 years ago. So Montana is a big mining state. Copper mining, gold mining, silver mining was a big deal. There's a place called Butte. It's been called the richest hill on earth. Huge copper mining. It's about 123 miles up the river from where I grew up. In that community, they did what was called basically open pit mining. And early on, they would take all of the stuff that came up with the copper and they would just pile it in the streets of Butte. Around the early 1900s, there was a dam that was built just upriver from where we are. And that dam was built for the logging community so that they could have water and energy available to process logs. And I'm really glad it was built when it was built, because the 6 months after it was built, the largest flood on record happened in Montana. And all of that arsenic and everything that came out with the copper out of those soils flushed down the headwaters of the Columbia River and jammed up against that dam. The only thing that saved our community from having thousands of years worth of cleanup was the fact that the dam stopped all of that nasty stuff. And nobody knew it because there weren't environmental laws at that point in time. Nobody knew that had happened until one winter it froze. That freezing, the freeze on the top of the river brought some of the soil over the top of the dam with it, and people started getting arsenic in their wells. So this place that was a river runs through, that was one of the cleanest places that you could possibly go to, started to be so contaminated people couldn't turn on their tap and drink the water. Montana, that stretch, that 123-mile stretch, is now the longest string of Superfund sites in the country. We didn't know, and now there's an incredibly massive cleanup, $123 million. The dam has now been removed, that soil has been removed, and that drinking water supply is safe. But if you don't have $123 million and you don't have the ability to do that investment, you have a community who can no longer drink water. So again, as I'm talking about my water story, I want you to think about how you grew up and where you grew up, and the things you were either lucky to have or the things that you didn't have, as we think about what we want the next 100 years to look like. So when we think about water in Oregon, I'm going to give a little bit of background that I think might help even for your broader conversations later. The water that we drink starts as snow or rain at the top of Mount Hood. And so in order to take care of that water, we have to take care of the forest lands that water flows through, that are owned by federal government, state government, private industry. We have to take care of that water as it flows through Christmas tree farms and nurseries and cattle operations and other places that are growing our food and our fiber. We have to make sure it's clean. And then it enters in pipes, whether that's from Bull Run, which is just up from here, and it comes here, right? So there are pipes that bring the water right here to PSU. There are pipes that take your wastewater out of PSU and back out to be processed and treated. And then that water continues, but it's going through river systems that are also taking care of fish, they're taking care of wildlife, which are first foods for tribal communities, which are incredibly important for our First Nations. As it continues to flow out through the system, again, the river and wetlands are taking care of it. As it begins to exit, you get out to the Coast Range, and a lot of those communities can't exist except they are protected by what we call levees, so big berms that protect a community, and tie gates that let stream flow out, but don't let ocean flow in. So a community like Warrenton out on the coast does not exist except for 11 miles of levees and 35 tie gates that protect it. So when we think about water, it's not just about what we drink, but it's how our communities are protected. So we have, and you'll find this on the document in front of you, we've identified 4 major goals, and I'm going to talk about them both from the positive side and from the challenges that we see now. So first, the first goal that we have is a health goal. We want to make sure that we have secure, safe, accessible, and healthy water for current and future Oregonians. We want that thing that we take for granted to continue to be available for the next 100 years as well. From an economic perspective, we want adequate clean groundwater, so well water and surface water, to support economic vitality for all Oregonians. And I'll give an example. 85% of the water that comes out of stream to be used is used by farmers and ranchers to produce the food that you eat when you go to the Portland Farmers Market or when you go to Freddy's to grab a bite to eat. That water is coming out of our rivers and being used for agricultural production so that you can have local, safe, accessible food. That same water is being used by Google and Facebook to make sure that their server farms are cooled so that we can have the cloud. So there's a lot of economic uses for water. From an environmental perspective, there's this assumption that water has to be used and it has to be used by humans. We're very egotistical when it comes to water. We're very self-centered. But water is critical for fish and wildlife. And having those healthy sponges to keep water up in our system makes sure that we are protected from droughts later in the year. And then the last piece that I mentioned before is safety. Do we have resilient supply? Do we have flood protection to keep us safe, to keep our communities safe? If you think about the Cascadia earthquake that we talk about all the time, they say to have 2 weeks of water available. I'm sure in dorm rooms around here, you've got plenty of room to have 2 weeks of water stored up. It's real because many communities do not have backup water supplies. So those pipes break in an earthquake and there is not access to water. And we all know you can't make it very long without access to clean water. Those same goals that we have for the future, I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've seen when we go across the state. Some of these, especially with an environmental justice and equity lens. So from a health perspective, again, generally we can access clean water when we need to. Raise your hand if you know where Warm Springs, the town of Warm Springs is. Okay, for those who don't, if you drive about 2 hours east of Portland, you start going towards Bend, Redmond, you pop over 26, you get past the ski hill, you go down, there's this great kind of ravine valley that you pop into, and that's the community of Warm Springs. It is the center for the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation. That community last summer lost its water for 2.5 months.
Yeah, how many of you heard that? 2.5 months. There were, I think, maybe 2 stories on OPB. We had Flint, Michigan going on in the middle of Oregon, and nobody was paying attention. So when we think about environmental justice, and when we think about health impacts, we have a town that didn't have water for 2.5 months, that foundations like Meyer Memorial Foundation and others were trucking in water. They had to shut down the school because they didn't have access to water. They had to shower with bottled water because there was absolutely no water supply in that community. So when we think you turn on the tap and it's easy, we have communities right here in the state that is not the case, and we need to be paying attention. We have other communities in the state that their water supply pipes are made out of wood and are 100 years old. That is not a real efficient way to deliver water for a community water supply. When we think about, I'll move over to the economic side. In far eastern Oregon, there's a place called Harney County, Burns, kind of in the southeast part of the state. 70% of the land in that county is federal land. Their largest industry by far is agriculture, and it is not a high-paying industry. The median income in that community is incredibly low compared to the rest of the state. They use water to irrigate their farms, to grow hay that gets shipped over to Tillamook so we can have cheese curds. I love cheese curds. So their livelihood is absolutely dependent on water. They use water that comes from the ground, comes up from wells, and they started to find out that their wells were decreasing. So they'd have a well drilled down 100 feet, it was going dry, pulling up mud. So then they'd have to drill deeper to 150 feet. They started looking into it. Some of their groundwater is dropping 10 feet a year. So if you think about that, in 2 years, the groundwater is going from where Melissa is in the back of the room down to nearly where I am. That means that they are pulling water that is not being replenished by snow and rain. So you can date water. You can not actually date water. You can figure out how old water is, how long it's been in a system. They tested that water that they are pulling up now is between 1,000 and 6,000 years old, which means they're not replenishing the water at the same rate that it's leaving, which means their community, which is incredibly dependent on that industry, has to figure out how they rethink an entire industry. From an environmental perspective, we have many challenges. We have mercury that is coming into our systems and it gets wrapped up in the fat in fish. And for tribal communities who consume high quantities of fish, they are exceeding their mercury levels. So it's a human health issue, but we also have streams that get so hot in the summer that fish are dying. That's happened down in the Klamath back in the early 2000s. That's happened up on the Columbia River system. So how do we help make sure that that water is not just cool, clean, and available for us, it's available for fish as well? And then the last piece from an environmental justice perspective is safety. I talked about the dam piece before and the tide gates and the levees. So how many of you have heard about Vanport? Wow, I'm very impressed. This is a well-informed group. So the community of Vanport out towards North Portland was flooded in the 1940s, decimated a working class community, a low-income community that nobody was paying attention to. There's an incredible, if you don't know it, there's an incredible video that OPB did that I highly recommend you look up. That's a safety issue. If we are not paying attention to those people who are most impacted, who we've stuck their community smack in the middle of the place that is most likely to flood, that's an impact that the rest of us don't see, but we lost the second largest city in the state at that point in time was Vanport. We face that same issue on the coast right now. We have dairy farmers, we have low-income communities out on the coast again that are only there because we're protecting them by tide gates and levees. And if we think about that, we might say, from an environmental perspective, let's just get rid of that, all of that. We need the people out of the way, we need the estuaries to come back. But then what does that do for the people who don't have the income to move somewhere else? What do we have to think about so that we can make sure that those communities continue to survive and